Hello, good people, and welcome to the Two Rivers Café Podcast, a friendly haunt where music meets the creative arts for a conspiratorial drink or two at the table by the window. I'm your host, Andrew Fisher. As a composer and lyricist, collaboration is one of the great joys in my life. In this podcast, I'll be talking to fellow artists, musicians, and creatives, sharing knowledge, experience, and hopefully some useful insight. Expect an eclectic mix of wildly talented people, honest conversation, and the odd happy accident, as each episode we tap into the flow to collaborate on a unique project. Will it always work? Let's find out. So, before we get started, I should say that we're making this edition of the Two Rivers Café podcast remotely because it's early 2021 and we can't leave our homes. But in happier news, I am delighted to be embarking on this episode's collaboration with writer, director, animator, candle maker, educator, and friend Phil Gomm. Hi, Phil.
Hey, Andy. That was a great introduction. Thank you.
Multi-talented. How are you today?
Not too bad. In fact, today's been a day with some candle making and some writing and some producing activities today. So it's been a day full of commas.
Cool. So the plan here is that you and I make something.
I love a collaboration. I've sort of been involved in so many projects in my previous life and now where that is the bread and butter. You know, you work fast, you respond to somebody else's prompt or something, and you have to get something done. I find it very invigorating, and it's always good because it's a bit like, oh yeah, the muscles still work.
Phil, before this recording, I shared 3 words with you from which I asked you to choose one as the jumping off point for our collaboration. Just to remind you, these words were memory, wine, and inside. Which word have you chosen, Phil?
Of the 3 words, I have selected wine, and I've selected wine for reasons that might surprise you. I've selected wine because really, I don't get it. I want to get it. I would love to get it. I would love to enjoy it as I know people enjoy it. It just doesn't agree with me. And to be honest with you, I think, you know, in terms of my way into this idea, I thought, I'm looking for a little bit of conflict. I'm looking for a little bit of grit in the oyster. And I think by choosing something that doesn't agree with me, I've already got some images in my brain. I've got some exciting ideas and a possible approach as well. So that's the one I'm going for.
Fantastic. A question that often emerges when music and film intertwine is which comes first? How does it work? And different types of film form have different sorts of modus operandi. In feature films, the music is always written afterwards in post-production once the film is being assimilated. Some forms of film are set to music. Do you have a particular preference here? Would you rather go and make something and then I score it? Would you rather me go and score something?
I do have a preference actually because I do a lot of stuff where because I have produced some stuff for CGI where it's so pipeline driven. So you have the script and then you have an animatic and then you have this and you have that, and it's essentially a huge exercise in delayed gratification. It's one of the least instinctive pipelines because you can't just get to your content. It's got to go through all these different layers. And what I would enjoy in this instance would be to let something happen and to control it ultimately, because in the end you make those creative decisions around it, and then hand it over to you to see what you hear when you look at it. Does that, because I think ultimately what music does is it tends to lock meaning in and change things and recalibrate the emotional resonance of something. And I would love to see that happen. I would love to think I'd made something that for me answers this wine idea, and I've explored it, and then it comes over to you and it becomes a different piece of work.
Well, that's very exciting. I can't wait to get started. So the plan is going to be that Phil will have first dibs and then will give me something and I will have a response to it. And we can't wait to see what happens. Welcome back. A reminder that you're listening to the Two Rivers Café Podcast with me, Andrew Fisher. Now, in your world, little time has passed, but in mine and Phil's world, a few days have whizzed by, and I'm excited to say that we've finished our collaboration. But before we hear it, and if it's all right with you, Phil, I'm going to ask you a few questions about creativity generally. Have you always been creative? Were you a creative child?
The short answer is yes. I was always a strange child. In fact, I know they're not the same necessarily, but the great refrain in my house was, "Will you get your head out of the clouds?" That was the
Okay.
general gist.
Yes.
I always was always writing, always thinking in terms of stories. That was normal. It never seemed particularly strange to me, but that I might recreate sort of in my room by myself, imagining something and writing something that perhaps nobody was going to read or whatever. So um, I never felt compelled to do things because I thought people would look at it. I just had things in my brain, and I would want to sort of see them sort of manifested. I wanted them out of me. So yeah, that was always there. Yeah.
How do you work? Do you work the same way, or do you deliberately work a different way, or do you have a certain pattern a series of patterns that you work differently for different sorts of projects?
I guess the key thing is that I'm not very good at procrastinating. So by that, I sort of have a strange guilt complex around productivity. And anyone who knows me would say that's true, that I sort of have a number of different things on the go at the same time. And one of the simple things I do, very simple, is that I have a little paper notebook, and at the beginning of the day, I just put the things I want to get done on it,
Mhm.
and I try and get through that list, because I think when you're doing lots of different things and you've got a portfolio life where you're not really defined by one discipline specifically, it's you can feel like an imposter in a way, because it's like, well, what are you? Do you write? Do you make films? Are you a garden person? What is it that you do? So the way to kind of like work against that imposter syndrome is to sort of write things down and go through the list. And it almost like by the end of the day, if I've done all of those things, I haven't been an imposter on Tuesday. But the process really is to, this is a cliche, but feel the fear and do it anyway. So often at the beginning of a project, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm racked with considerations that it's all going to go wrong, and I just stay sat on my bum for long enough to get past those reservations. And that might be sort of like ego, or that I don't know what that is, but I try not to stand up when I'm afraid. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, I'm very similar. That no matter what you've done in the past, the new challenge in front of you can still be absolutely terrifying. It doesn't get easier.
No, and I think that the thing that I think Stephen King, I think this is him, or maybe it isn't him. Maybe he paraphrased another writer that just said about the secret to writing a novel is the application of your bum to a chair. And I've always felt that at the heart of some of the stuff that I do. I think when I hear people talk about the muse, and I hear people talk about some of the kind of more um, sort of like I don't know, sort of the magical relationship to creativity, I do have moments like that, and I think, wow, yes, I've been possessed today by the muse. But often it's about, I sat on my bum for long enough today to make something happen.
Your creativity, can you switch it on, or is it always with you? Is it always active?
I can't always switch it on, but I know I've been on the planet long enough now, and I'm sort of old and ugly enough to know that there is going to be a moment when I can sort of insert myself into the work. So it might be that initially I'm circling something, and I just literally think, this isn't me. This has got nothing to do with me. I don't know why I'm doing this. And then I'm always looking for that lovely moment when, and it can be quite small, when you suddenly realize that you are going to be able to imprint on it in some way. And maybe that sounds very, um, I don't know, very egoistic, but I think all creatives are looking to imprint, because that's how it feels authentic. That's like, okay, that's my route into making the work. So I guess when a director gets a script that's somebody else's, the moment that they arrive at the scene that they can visualize very strongly, they're beginning to imprint, and then they can start to kind of open up inside of the whole script, if you like, or do that. I've only had writer's block once, when I was sort of writing a very long novel that no one will ever read. But that was a very frightening time. It lasted for about 8 days, and I was on chapter 14 of a novel that was probably about 200,000 words long by then. So I was a long way over the bridge, and I got into this chapter and I didn't know what was going to happen. it was physical, that feeling of creativity being turned off. It was a physical feeling, and I don't suffer from insomnia, but I had insomnia, and I was miserable.
Right.
So when I fixed the chapter, and it was a quick fix, ultimately, it was an easy fix. I just couldn't see it at the time. It really felt like, yeah, it felt like a serious moment of relief. So, so I have a very strong memory of what it was like to sort of open the cupboard and find nothing.
I know myself it is a miserable place to be, but the word fear is the right one, isn't it? Because that becomes totally consuming, and it's baffling. You're trying to solve what's happened, why, so it takes quite a lot of very deliberate thinking, doesn't it, to try and say, okay, what has happened what could I not do, what challenge lay in front of me that stopped the process.
But when you live with people who perhaps who aren't, not necessarily who aren't creative, but sort of aren't sort of under the pressure perhaps to deliver all the time, I get very conscious sometimes of disappearing from them, because I've gone inside and I'm worrying about something and it belongs to me. And when I'm like that, if I go to the pub, for example, I'm drinking a pint, I'm not really there. I'm not really drinking that pint. I should have stayed at home. I'm an elephant who goes off to die in those moments, because I can't gain solace from sharing, because in the end I feel silly that I'm sort of having a bad day because of some abstract idea that I can't nail, while life goes on.
So, Phil, one question before we start to talk about our collaboration is, do you personally always see creativity as inherently collaborative, or do you see it as private and then parts of that become collaborative?
For me, when I've been at my poorest, when I've been at my most unwell, when I've been at my most kind of like, you know, at odds, the ability to know that you can write and that you have the full range of powers by yourself and that it can't be taken from you, that sort of creativity can feel incredibly powerful. But some of the most satisfying, emotional, transformative experiences I've had creatively have been with other people,
Mm.
and with more talented people than me, if I'm being honest, and often with much younger people than me. So certainly, some of the big animation projects that I've done, some of the big sort of like live theatre things I've done, that have been with musicians and school kids or undergraduates. Um, Creatively, they've been fully saturated in terms of color. They've been extraordinary, emotional. I mean, you don't tend to sort of cry and sort of feel that you want to hug the world when you're working by yourself in your sort of spare room. But I remember just briefly going to the dress rehearsal for the big orchestra animation we did, and there was the full musicians, and there was all the students I'd worked with, and we got to the end of the piece of music. And I had to have a word with myself and leave, because nobody wants to see sort of like a middle-aged man crying. But it was so powerful, because I knew behind me, if I looked behind me, all the other team were having were having goosebumps as well, and it was a shared thing. So absolutely, to be able to go into your own private space and write, I love that. It feels incredibly powerful. It feels liberating, and it feels safe and autonomous. But I absolutely know the allure of working with other people, and it brings its own challenges. It absolutely changes the dynamic, and you sort of have to sort of like find ways to sort of to deal with people and to let people in and all those things. But
Mm.
when it's good and when it works, it is absolutely addictive.
Mm. I love that thing where you're working with people and everyone feels free to make offers. And I love that thing where you have something and then those offers enrich it. And so the artistic product, whatever it is so much better for the fact that people are making offers to it. And obviously there needs to be some curating of those offers to have an overall vision. But that for me is always interesting when you've written something and then you hand it over to, in my case, a singer or an actor or something, and then they find a nuance in your text that you go, oh wow, suddenly the story's about this as well as that, and those moments are like really exciting for me, because there's a discovery that you make. You think, this is what I brought, but it's that whole kind of humbling. I was looking at this whole story from this perspective. Someone else is now inhabiting the story, and they're bringing out these things, and it's so much richer. I find those thrilling, absolutely wildly thrilling. But part of that, I think, is creating an environment where people can safely make offers.
No, I agree, and I think that's where the skill around project management collaboration is producing those conditions authentically. So it's not performative, like, yeah, I am listening, I'm not listening. It is to remain open. And I think it's not always easy when you're under time pressures, and it's not always easy if you're also dealing with kind of like the classic sort of interpersonal politics of collaborations that can sort of hamper or change or come to dominate. But as I said, I've had enough collaborative experiences where the reward in remaining open is obvious because it works, and everybody feels like they're a stakeholder. Everybody feels that they can sit in the front row at the premiere. Everyone feels that they're in it, and I don't know. They've just been some of my most precious experiences of working in teams, really.
We've made you wait long enough, and now it's time to unveil the piece that Phil and I have worked on together. Now, this is a visual piece, so please do follow the link in the description of this podcast to see Phil's animation in all its glory. And in the meantime, this is what it sounds like.
Wine doesn't agree with me. I want the berries and the cherries and the apricots and the plum. I want the flint and the petrol and the oak and the earth. When instead, I just get acid, and I'm tasting vinegar, and I'm burping and there's bile, and I'm feeling fire, I feel a rasp, and there's a prickle, and I'm in pain. It's like being colourblind when everyone else is tasting a rainbow. The world of wine gives us Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. The world of wine gives me reflux, bellyache, and heartburn. The world of wine gives us Chardonnay and Rioja. The world of wine gives me omeprazole.
I'm a big fan of what you created. I was really blown away by it, and watching it again and again, I began to see more and more of what was going on. Tell me a bit about how you created those shifting images, all those brilliant textures and swirls and colours. What did you do?
Well, for me, there's an in-joke there because obviously the subtext of the joke for me was the fact that wine, I chose wine, out of the options, I chose that one. It's slightly counterintuitive because, as people will understand when they watch the film, that wine doesn't agree with me. So I have a disappointing experience of wine. For me, it's acidic and it doesn't taste the way I know it's supposed to. So the concept, if you want to call it that, it's a bit grand, was that there is a particular way that you can use rubbing alcohol to corrode a particular type of pen, an alcohol-based pen. And it made me laugh internally that perhaps I could produce images by using the spritz of alcohol to corrode a surface and to make colors run and discolor, because I thought that it was probably an immediate bridge between my experience of wine and how I could perhaps sort of move that and flow that literally into the images. So to give you an insight into to the nuts and bolts of how it was made, some of the imagery was made by drawing into the inside of a very large sort of white ceramic bowl, a very large white bowl that I drew inside of. So I drew the text elements and I sort of stratas of colors. And then I was able to sort of film into that, spritz that surface with the rubbing alcohol, and then watch as the tendrils formed and the sort of the more explosive things began to happen. And it's all sort of frame by frame. So it's sort of stop motion come time lapse, because you're looking at an active process that's happening on a surface. And you're sort of like, taking a still image sort of every 2 seconds to kind of to capture it. So yes, and then that was basically the long and short of it, which was, I wonder if I can produce an animation by producing the kind of effects that wine has on me. That was kind of
I was wondering whether you used actual wine for the drops, but it's rubbing alcohol, which is
it's rubbing alcohol and sort of alcohol-based pigments. So no, not actual wine, because wine, in fact, is too wet. So in that respect, what you're essentially doing is you're allowing the marker pens to sort of dry and sort of attach, and then it means that when they're spritzed, there's this sort of moment where it's all held, it's coalesced, and then suddenly from that point it's always slipping towards chaos after that. So it was like controlled chaos, if that makes sense.
we're literally watching a chemical reaction. Perfect for the text that you were saying, and I remember watching that and actually feeling a bit stomachy and a bit acidy. Just the sort of suggestion of it was so powerful, and also the way that you were using different colors.
There's a line in the animation about sort of being colorblind, and in the film itself that sequence is black and white, but with colorblind, actually I think it's where actual colors aren't black and white. They're just sort of slightly off what they should be. And I think for me the contrast was, you have the lovely fruit and sort of wholesome colors, the sort of fruit colors and the sort of the gold colors, and the sort of when people describe wine and talk about this kind of cosmos of, yeah, I don't know, fragrances or whatever, this lovely swirling, ocean of, like, flavors, that I wanted to sort of express those things in colors that we had sort of positive associations with. And obviously, as we sort of move towards perhaps uh, my experience of acid reflux, that obviously was sort of seeking to sort of put a slightly more poisoned, yeah, sort of like polluted color scheme in there. And there's a dance between those two sort of palettes, something queasy and something sort of fruity and wholesome, and and that's the contrast, really.
When you heard my music, was it what you were expecting? Were you thinking this works? Were you thinking how interesting it cuts against everything I was talking about?
Well, no, I mean, I couldn't wait, to be honest with you, because I think when we spoke at the very beginning of this project, the idea was, I don't know, maybe I'm just a child, like a pass the parcel type child, but the idea of you unwrapping something and not knowing what was in it, and then me getting to unwrap it again, just to me just seemed very exciting. And we know that collaboration can be done very differently, because, as you've said before, it can be done with a much more sort of co-authorship. But for me, there was something about the surprise of this, and so I couldn't wait to see it, I've got to be honest with you. So I was sort of, and also I was worried that it was like not going to press your buttons, obviously, that you'd have a mojo-less moment of looking at this kind of this poor guy talking about his stomach. I sort of love the fact that there's this, what you do is you ghost the score with the version of the film or the version of wine that you're sort of that we're hoping is there. Or when we think about wine, we are compelled to think in sort of about sort of the French bistro, or we're compelled to think in those terms. It's on the tip of our tongue already. It's sort of like in our inner ear, and it's there. And then you're able to kind of pull it apart, and obviously that's happening within the animation as well. So in that respect, I there's a lovely bit, I think, towards the end, where there's this kind of sunburst of liquid, which is sort of relatively sort of unpleasant, and you've got this pizzicato in there, which is literally like the it is the musical equivalent of the moment when I know that this thing is starting. So I felt that was incredibly pinpoint accurate, to be honest with you. It was like, oh yes, that's the pizzicato of my stomach lining that you've evoked there. Congratulations.
When I was writing it, I had sort of two thoughts initially. One, as I was thinking about wine, was the experience of tasting wine, that we don't have one flavor immediately hit us. Or we can, but sometimes you get a second flavor and a third flavor, and that for me was important textually and texturally, to have this. Okay, here's idea one, here's idea two, here's idea three, here's idea four. So these different timbres, these different colors, these different gestures give you different sort of hits. And then there's a wine experience, and I was trying to match that. The second thing I noticed was the way that you were performing the text felt really like a song lyric. There was a poetic form and meter to it that I was very conscious of. Where you were placing the downbeats struck me as, that's the first beat of the bar. And that for me was something I immediately responded to technically. So I set down what we call a tempo map, where I was placing the time signature and the speed according to the natural rhythm of your speaking voice.
Well, I was going to ask you that question because I nearly sort of emailed you to say I think I'm going to have to punctuate this with some spoken word, otherwise it's going to fall away into complete abstraction. And it felt like, because of the sort of the nature of the imagery and the way it was made, it's almost like you control it in post-production, because when you're filming it, you're just getting the results and then you review the footage. But even at that point, I understood I need to structure it. So that's where sort of the and you're right about the written word and labeling so that I wanted that in there as well. But so the spoken word, I just thought, I wonder if this is an imposition. I just think, is Andy going to sort of get this and just go, I can't believe he's talking as well. But it's very interesting to hear that for you that suddenly became kind of like Velcro that you could attach some conceptualization to as well, and that you needed to respond to that. I mean, that wasn't in my brain at all, that you would have to manage it or in that sense.
Did you enjoy the process?
Yes, I mean, I did. I mean, I like the fact that I was sort of launched into something. I like the fact that I had limited means as well. I think that, without wanting to sound like a masochist, there's something always for me that propels creativity, which is about constraint and not having lots of choices. I think you can almost feel your brain working. You can feel the architecture happening, because you can't, say, oh, well, if I had all of this other kit, or if I had all this money, I could solve these problems. It's like, no, I'm just going to sort of work in a limited way and make sense of those materials, or make sense of those limitations.
I think that's a great insight. I can totally relate to that, how limitations can actually be necessary, essential for creative work. Sometimes I think I've got so much choice, I don't know what to make. If you take things out and say, I'll give myself 3, say, instruments to play with, or 3 colors to create with, or 3 concepts to work with, that can actually be the necessary fuel for the creative act, I think.
I think there is a key there to creativity and not procrastinating, which is that there is something about short, resolvable projects that are really good for staying limber. And I was certainly, if you asked for some advice, about creativity earlier, and I think that sort of short, sharp, resolvable, and realizable creative projects are just absolutely key. And it's not just because, I haven't got the attention span. It's just the fact that it is great to open something up, and I think it's great to have a direct experience, not too much time reflecting and mediating and worrying. I think and I didn't have the time. It was good, but it's amazing when with a bit of experience, when you know how it's going to coalesce in post, and what you're seeing in the frame bears no resemblance to the materials being used to make it. And that's the other big thing, isn't it, about creativity, is that when you've got that experience, that it's all about what's in the frame. It's and it's not about the periphery. It's about, is it working? And when the answer is yes, again, that can feel very liberating, because you can realize that actually we can make work simply and quickly. We don't need $1 million budgets, and we can work directly.
Phil, thank you so much for being part of this. It's been a privilege for me and an absolute treat. I really love what you've done.
Thank you.
And I think, having talked about it for 10 minutes, it's probably a good idea to hear the piece again. So here is Wine Doesn't Agree With Me by Phil Gomm and me, Andrew Fisher.
Wine doesn't agree with me. I want the berries and the cherries and the apricots and the plum. I want the flint and the petrol and the oak and the earth. When instead, I just get acid, and I'm tasting vinegar, and I'm burping, and there's bile, and I'm feeling fire. I feel a rasp, and there's a prickle, and I'm in pain. It's like being colourblind when everyone else is tasting a rainbow. The world of wine gives us Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. The world of wine gives me reflux, bellyache and heartburn. The world of wine gives us Chardonnay and Rioja. The world of wine gives me omeprazole.
Thanks for joining me in the Two Rivers Café, and thanks so much to Phil Gomm for his excellent company and for creating such a vivid, fascinating piece of work. You can see our collaboration by following the link in the description of this podcast. And this is also the place to find links to more examples of Phil's work and a link to my website, where you can discover more about my life as a composer. My name is Andrew Fisher, and this edition of the Two Rivers Café podcast was produced remotely by Jim and Rupert of Driver 8. If you enjoyed it, then please tell your friends to subscribe. Look out for the next episode when it appears, but in the meantime, I encourage you to get creative and collaborate yourselves, and know you can sometimes be helped by a little conversation and tea and cake. Goodbye.